So welcome to the 5th Bar-Ilan Winter School on cryptography. This year we're looking at advances in practical multi-party computation. First, thanks to our sponsors, we have quite a few. It's a large winter school, so we needed a lot of sponsors. First, the Israeli National Cyber Bureau contributed a lot, the European Research Council through an ERC grant, and also the FP7 framework through the Practice Consortium, which deals with multi-party computation, Bar-Ilan University, and also the Checkpoint Institute for Information Security at Tel Aviv University also graciously helped us to fund this event. In general, for those of you who haven't been here before, the aim of our winter schools is quite unique. We don't take a topic and bring a whole lot of random lecturers to talk about their most recent research, but we really try to study the subject from the very beginning, from the basics, up into the latest research. That's what the concept has always been. So the lectures are coordinated. It has a planned flow from the beginning to the end, and this really enables us to teach a topic properly. People who have, everyone here has basic background in cryptography. How much you've seen of secure computation or not doesn't really matter, because that's why we're starting today from tutorials. And moving up into the last day, we're really on the last day, we're actually doing a mini workshop this year, which is something new. We'll actually really see the latest research, and I believe that you should be able to follow what's happening in the field very easily, given what you'll have seen this week. So we're talking about practical multi-party computation. 20 years ago, that was an oxymoron. There was no such thing as practical multi-party computation. It was a topic of theoretical study. And the progress has been amazing over the last 5 to 10 years. And really today we've seen huge progress, both algorithmic and cryptographic, that enables us to actually solve many real-world problems. And this has actually resulted in there being a lot of interest from industry as well as from academia on solving problems of privacy and security using multi-party computation. There are a number, I wouldn't say a lot, but there are a number of startup companies which are now looking at deploying MPC. There are some larger companies who are interested, who are playing around with the ideas, and this is very exciting for us in academia, having looked at this in theory for 20 years or so, now to be able to, well, personally not me, 20 years, I'm not that old, for me say 15 years, but now to actually see that all of these results are culminating in actual solutions is something which is very exciting. The schedule of the school is as follows. Today we're going to study the basics. We'll start with definitions, go through the YAO and GNW protocols for general multi-party computation, study the specific problems of oblivious transfer and zero knowledge, and we'll also finish off the day with how to obtain security for malicious adversaries, with the focus of that last segment will be actually on the theoretical side, understanding what the difficulties are, because over the next 3 days, Monday, Tuesday and Wednesday, most of the hard work will be taking these basic ideas that you'll learn today about YAO and GMW and managing to achieve higher efficiency, mostly for the malicious setting. So that's very important to understand today what the challenges are, and then that'll be useful for later on. Tomorrow, the focus will mainly be on YAO, but not only. So optimization is doing it efficiently, getting security from malicious adversaries. On Tuesday, we'll study the Tiny OT protocol, which is based on the GMW approach, not the YAO approach. It's a two-party protocol. Actually, in last year's Eurocrypt, there was already a version now for multi-party, so things move very, very quickly. On Wednesday, we'll study the Speeds protocol, which is based on somewhat homomorphic encryption. So if you've heard of fully homomorphic encryption or somewhat homomorphic and you think that it's pure theory, on Wednesday we'll show you that's actually not the case. And this is the most efficient multi-party computation protocol known. And on last day, we'll have a series of short lectures, half-hour lectures on results from the last year. And that'll also give you a feeling in seeing where we're going and how fast things really are moving. Deepest thanks go to everyone who helped. So Yonit, who's outside at the registration desk, really does the bulk of the work here, getting everything organized, logistics, and it's a huge job, so thank her when you have the opportunity. Benny Pincus, who is my school co-organizer, we worked together to organize everything, so I guess if he was up here he'd be thanking me, but since I'm up here I'll be thanking him. Our speakers who really put in a lot of effort. It's not coming to give a talk, half an hour talk on a result that you had. It's preparing long lectures, a few hours of lectures. This is a significant investment of time. So Ivan Damgard, Claudio Orlandi, Benny, Thomas Schneider, who actually unfortunately due to a family crisis is not able to come. I'll give his lecture. I'll give a lecture in his place tomorrow. Abi Shelat and myself, I guess. So a little bit about our speakers. For those of you who don't know them, Ivan Damgard, who will be teaching the Speeds protocol, is really one of the most prolific and influential researchers in the field, in general in cryptography, and also in multi-party computation. He has both fundamental results and also has been very active in the topic of efficiency. So we're very privileged to have him. Claudio also is a younger researcher, younger Ivan, I guess. We'll see, he'll get there. And his research focus is on efficient multi-party computation, has some very, very important results, including the Lego and Tiny OT protocols, and in general is very active in his field, and he's an excellent teacher as well. So we look forward to hearing him. Benny, who's here from Bar-Ilan, is really one of the people who was very involved in looking at how we can make this topic of theory, the subject of theory, efficient and used in practice. He was behind the first implementation ever of multi-party computation or two-party computation, where no one even thought there would be something that's even worth bothering to try to implement because it just won't work. So with fair play and the multi-party fair play, he showed that's actually possible. Has a lot of works on the Yao-based approach and also on specific problems of interest. So he'll also be speaking. Thomas, as I mentioned, unfortunately is unable to come, but Thomas has a book called Engineering Secure Two-Party Computation Protocols, which I actually highly recommend. It looks at really the optimizations, the low-level optimizations that are really important for making the transition from theory to practice. And he has a number of very important contributions. I guess the Freak Saw is the most famous, and that's really, really a very important tool that we use. Abi Shelat, from the University of Virginia, has done a lot of work on really optimizing protocols, Yao for Malicious and otherwise, and showing that implementations can be far better than we thought possible. And he'll be talking about the Yao-based approach and how to optimize it and how also to implement it in a way that will actually be really useful. Participants are from all over the place, as you can see here, or the majority are from Israel. I guess that's to be expected, but we have a very large contingent from overseas, from all around the world. If you look here, I guess it's easy to see it this way. From Europe, the USA, or North America in general, also from Asia and other places. The other places is one person from New Zealand, so we even got that far. Just a couple of short announcements. Today we're here at Bar-Ilan. Don't get confused and come back here tomorrow. It'll be empty. We're at the Kfar Maccabea Hotel for the rest of the week. There's a wireless connection here. It's BRU Wi-Fi H. It's a public network. There's no passwords. So you're welcome to try and bring down the network. Please try to be punctual, generally in the morning, and in all talk so that we can keep things moving. Thank you again to all the speakers who've come and have put in a huge amount of work preparing the program, to Unit Outside, and to all of you for coming, because you're the ones who make the school. So with no further ado, we'll begin the actual school. Okay, so I'm going to talk about definitions. That'll be the bulk of this session, and also the Oblivious transfer primitive, which is one of the most fundamental primitives that we have, and it's also essential in I think any protocol that, or almost any protocol, I guess Speeds not so much, that does secure multi-party computation. Starting with definitions and the basic setting, start very slowly, but try not to fall asleep because at some stage it'll speed up. So there are a set of parties with private inputs, and they wish to jointly compute some function of their inputs while preserving some security properties, even if they're under attack. So if some of the parties are corrupted and try to attack the protocol, by attack we'll mean a number of things which we'll talk about later. But so on the one hand, they want to collaborate, but they don't necessarily trust each other. This actually makes a lot of sense in, for example, business scenarios where different companies actually do want to collaborate, but it's not that they'll give up their private data to their potential competitors. But also in other settings like security agencies, there is this idea that we want to release as little information as possible, so this sort of scenario makes a lot of sense. One of the interesting things and important things about secure multi-party computation is that it can essentially model any cryptographic task that we want. So understanding what can and cannot be done in secure computation has huge ramifications for the entire field of cryptography. The applications, the list is very, very long. For years, actually, the academic world talked about elections and auctions. So auctions, Partisia, who I mentioned, is one of the companies actually working in secure multi-party computation, actually does run auctions. But the applications are actually, the ones that are of interest today are very, very different. They include private database search, privacy-preserving data mining, secure set intersection, which is a tool but also an application. And there are many, many more. I'm not going to focus so much on them. You'll hear, I guess, more throughout the school. But if you're all here, you understand that it's important, so I don't need to go further on that. I want to try and explain what we're looking for when we say preserving certain security properties, and I want to do it with a secure auction. I could have taken any example, but this is just an easy one. So we want a secure auction with secret bids, so only the winning bid should be revealed. Why would we want that? Well, maybe it's a game theoretic auction and we want certain properties to be preserved, and it'll help us if only the winning bid is revealed so that people won't be afraid to bid what they really want to bid. The first thing, if we want the bids to remain private, is that we want actually privacy, and that means that only the winning bid will be revealed. So an adversary who's trying to attack the protocol may try to learn what I bid, even if I didn't win, and this would be a breach of what we call privacy. Learning more than what is allowed by the function is what we call privacy. I just want to stress something which is fundamentally different about secure computation and encryption. Encryption is actually very easy to model. Well, it's actually not that easy, but it's quite easy to model because nothing whatsoever is learned. It's like zero knowledge also. Nothing whatsoever is learned. So we can argue that in quite a reasonable way, how to say that nothing has been learned. In secure computation, it's harder to define because something is learned. The output of the function is revealed. So how do we say that only that is revealed and nothing else? That's one of the challenges when defining secure computation. A second thing that an adversary might want to do is to try to win the auction without necessarily giving the highest bid. So someone maybe would have bid $10,000, but this adversary only bid $100, but yet the result of the computation somehow is that the highest bid was $100. And this obviously is something that we'd want to prevent, and that's what we call correctness. Okay, so the correct function has to be computed. Another thing which is a more subtle attack is something called independence of inputs. What happens if the adversary can actually make his bid depend on the other party's bids? So somehow he can make his bid be $1 more than the highest bid from all others. This is something that we also wouldn't want because it obviously makes the auction unfair. I can make sure that I win with losing the least amount of money, but making sure that I win, so I have the highest bid. It might sound very weird, how can you do such a thing? But this relates to malleability of encryption. That is actually, these things are actually possible on many encryption schemes. So we want independence of inputs, we want to prevent that from happening as well. You have to give your input without making it being correlated or dependent on the other party's inputs. Another thing that we would like, but as I mentioned later on is very often impossible, we'd like the execution to be fair. That means that if one party gets output, then all parties get output. It's not a very nice situation if the adversary learns the output but no one else does. Or even worse, if the adversary can learn the output and then just make the result happen or not happen, or be output depending on what the result is. So if it's an election, then the adversary waits to see who won the election, and if it's the candidate they wanted, then everything's fine, everyone gets output. Otherwise he does a denial of service and no one gets output. That would be a bad thing. We wouldn't want that to happen. So these are the general security properties that we want: privacy, correctness, independence of inputs, fairness, guaranteed output delivery, which is very related, meaning that the output will always be learned. And one way of defining security is simply to take that list and say, okay, I'm going to now look at every specific problem I'm trying to solve, if it's an auction or an election, and I'm going to try to analyze what the exact properties are. Like I analyzed that list on auctions, I want to try and analyze. So I come to elections, and I think with elections, okay, privacy, obviously I want privacy. I don't want my person I bid for to necessarily be revealed. Correctness, we mentioned, is clear. Fairness, probably. And then maybe we finished, but then we might think afterwards, 1 second, what are the independence of inputs? Maybe that's important. Maybe I want to vote for one candidate, but then if I see that their party doesn't actually even get into the parliament, I'll vote for another. If you have 85 different political parties, then this makes sense, and we have an upcoming election. I'm not sure if we're at 85, but we're probably not that far away. The problem is that how do we know that all concerns are actually covered? When you try to analyze and make a list of the actual concerns, it's actually easy to miss things and to think maybe we've covered all of our concerns, but there are very subtle attacks that we hadn't thought of. And also the definition becomes application dependent. For every single application, we need an expert cryptographer to sit down, come up with definitions, come up with the requirements. This is something which isn't very good if we want the world to actually use this. Because coming up with good definitions, we know, is very difficult. Even just for encryption, arguably, it's still in a work of progress today. There are still new definitions with stronger properties, but it definitely, at the very least, took 10 to 15 years to properly define encryption in the way that we're happy with today. So the second option is to come up with a general definition that will somehow capture all or most of the properties that we want, and will be something that is very easy to understand. So there'll be, anybody can understand what the guarantees are, and we don't have to go into this long list of the exact properties, and it's not going to be dependent on the application. It sounds like something which is very attractive. In order for such a definition to be meaningful, it needs to have the following properties. First, there has to be a well-defined adversary model. So who is our adversary? What is their capability? What can they do? What can they not do? And just like with any cryptographic definition, we don't assume anything about the adversary's strategy, because we don't know what that strategy will be, and if we do, then they'll come up with a different strategy afterwards. But we can assume something about their capability. So are they able to completely control parties that are participating? Are they able to come externally, break into new parties based on what they see? Are they able to interject messages over the network? These are the sort of things that we're used to in encryption, like deciding whether you want a chosen plain text attack or a chosen ciphertext attack. It's an adversary's capability. We need a well-defined execution setting. So how are the parties linked, in what sort of network? How do they communicate? That's very important. And we want something which, as I mentioned, has very clear and easy to understand security guarantees. So first, understanding adversaries. There are classically been 3 adversary models that have been proposed. Semi-honest and malicious are really the classic ones, and they're the most popular. But covert is also becoming more and more of interest. So a semi-honest adversary is one that follows the protocol specification. So it's rather a benign adversary. He doesn't actually do any active attacking. He follows the protocol specification, but he tries to learn more than allowed by inspecting the transcript. So it's quite a weak adversary, actually. He just does exactly what he's supposed to do, and then looks at the messages that were sent and tries to learn information. So why is it of interest? There are a couple of answers. First, it's of interest because it's a building block to getting stronger security. And that's already a good enough answer, but actually there are a number of settings where semi-honest makes sense. Let's say there are 2 hospitals who want to carry out a secure computation over the union of their patient databases to do privacy-preserving data mining. It's better, the more information you have, the better the data mining results are. And if you can have from diverse regions, that's even better. So hospitals collaborating makes a lot of sense. But hospitals are bound by privacy law. They're not allowed to take their patient databases and export them to anywhere else. But they're not actually worried about being attacked by each other. Right? Neither hospital has really the motivation to try and attack another, so it's reasonable to assume that they are semi-honest. Beyond that, semi-honest security actually implies protection against inadvertent leakage. So if we have 2 hospitals, it's one thing that I say, I don't believe the other hospital is going to try to maliciously attack and learn my patient data, but their IT department may be terrible. It's a public service hospital and they haven't got much money, so their IT people are really bad, and the security of the systems are really bad. So I don't want any remnants of my database to be sitting on their systems. And as soon as a protocol is secure against semi-honest adversaries, there's no inadvertent leakage. And this is provably the case because by looking at the transcript, you can learn nothing whatsoever. That's another place where semi-honest might make sense. And the third place is where you can assume, or you think it's reasonable to assume, some lockdown on the machine. So if you have very, very well-hardened machines and the users are unable to change anything on the machines, then maybe it will be difficult to replace the protocol that's running on the machine. In general, however, it's not going to be strong enough. We want something much stronger, which is what we call malicious adversaries. So malicious adversaries, the other extreme, they can do anything they want. We're going to assume that it's an efficient attack, so it runs in polynomial time, but we're not going to assume anything beyond that. And security against malicious adversaries means no matter what the adversary tries to do, no matter what strategy they try to follow, they won't be able to succeed in doing anything whatsoever, of course, as in with anything in modern cryptography, except with negligible probability. Covert is something in the middle. A covert adversary is a malicious adversary in the sense that we're not limiting them in any way, we're not assuming anything about their behavior, but we're not going to guarantee that they will never succeed. All we're going to guarantee is that there's some deterrent factor, which means that if they try to attack the protocol, then they'll be caught with a certain probability. So you can set that to be a half, or 90%, or 99%, or 99.9, depending on what the setting is. And this means that in fact there is a probability, a reasonable probability that I will succeed in attacking the protocol, but there's also a reasonable probability that they'll be caught. And if you're thinking in, for example, a business setting where you have collaborating companies, and if a company is caught cheating, they'll be thrown out of the consortium, no one will collaborate with them anymore, then it can be actually very reasonable to assume covert adversaries, again, depending on what the damage can be done, the damage that would be done if they actually succeed in cheating. So if, for example, you're protecting a key, a secret key, which if it's revealed will have disastrous effects, then you would not want to use covert security. But if you're protecting a database with millions of small data items, where each item is actually has very little information, but it's really the aggregate that makes sense, and someone is able to learn, for example, a specific item with probability 1/2, then this actually may be very, very reasonable. And it's in terms of efficiency, there's a real trade-off here, because semi-honest we can do very efficiently. Malicious is much harder, but we're working hard on making it more and more efficient. And covert is, depending on the term probability you take, really fills in that entire gap. So if you're going for probability 1/2, it's only twice to 4 times the cost of semi-honest, and the higher you go, the closer it gets to malicious. For adversarial power, we can assume polynomial time, or even computationally unbounded or information theoretic, although we won't be considering that in this school. Corruption strategy is also something we have to define. What do we assume about the adversary? There are two basic models. The static model means that we have a set of parties who wish to collaborate, and some of those are corrupted. So some of the parties are cheats, they are malicious, or whatever they are, they're semi-honest or malicious, and they want to try to attack the protocol. But it's fixed, the set of corrupted parties is fixed before the execution begins. A much stronger model is adaptive, and this model is the case where at some point throughout the execution, based on what's happened so far in the execution, the adversary can actually choose who to corrupt. So this model is like a modern hacking attack where you decide to actively try to break into a machine which actually suits your needs. So if you had a protocol, for example, which involved 100 parties, and the first thing they do is chose randomly 5 parties to carry out the actual computation for them, then an attacker who's an adaptive and who can reasonably breach 5 machines could actually wait until the 5 were chosen and then go and attack those. So they would not be secure under that model. In general, adaptive security is much, much, much harder. And if we're talking about practical or highly efficient multi-party computation, unfortunately, for as far as adaptive security goes, we're still quite far away. Although there are different flavors, there's with erasures, without erasures. With erasures, it's actually more possible, but we won't deal with it in this school. It's, again, more advanced material. There's also a question of the execution setting. Do we assume a standalone setting where a single protocol is run, or a concurrent setting where general arbitrary protocols all run together? Once again, the concurrent setting is the more realistic setting. giving you stronger guarantees, and it's a very important model, but we won't consider it here. Again, it's more advanced. The question of how much damage can really be done to a standalone protocol run in a concurrent setting is one that's still relatively open. Okay, so they're all the parameters. The parameters that typically we are going to look at is static adversaries, malicious and semi-honest in the standalone setting. That in itself is very difficult enough, and it's also actually enough to solve many problems that we are interested in practice, so it's a good starting point. But what can we do in this? Can we actually achieve this notion that nothing will be learned except for the result? I didn't define it formally yet, but it's important to understand that actually this notion is a very, very powerful one, and we can actually securely compute any functionality that we want. So in theory at least, anything you want to solve securely, any distributed task you want to solve securely, you can actually do that. And if you have an honest majority, you can even do it information theoretically. So that's something which is very amazing. If you don't have an honest majority, then we have a problem with fairness. I mentioned that, making sure that if one party gets output, then all parties get output. In general, that's not possible. It's actually more possible than we thought, but not very efficiently. But if you don't mind giving up on fairness, then once again you can solve absolutely everything. So this is very good news. We're not talking about a definition which is empty or which solves very sort of some few not very interesting problems. It really solves anything you want to do. Of course, the question of how efficient it will be, if you want to run a very complex algorithm, distributed algorithm on terabytes of data, that's something which will be very, very difficult. So it does depend on the size and the complexity of the computation, but in theory we can do absolutely anything we want. Okay, now let's start getting into actually into some more serious definitions. So I'm going to denote the security parameter by n, and we're going to want that security will hold for inputs of all lengths, as long as you've taken a large enough security parameter. Okay, so similar to what we do in encryption. Obviously, as with everything in the computational setting, we're going to allow failure with negligible probability, where a negligible function is one that's smaller than the inverse of every polynomial. So essentially, we can just assume that it doesn't happen, because something that happens with small enough probability is not interesting. Tomorrow, and also, I guess, for the next 3 days, when we talk about actually concretely efficient protocols, we're going to actually want to bound this cheating probability by something very concrete. So 2 to the minus 40 or 2 to the minus 80. I personally can live very well with a 2 to the minus 40 probability of someone cheating. It's probably a higher probability that a meteorite will hit this room. So I'm not sure. 2 to the minus 40 is very small. In order to define security, we're going to have to look at probability ensembles, which essentially are distributions over outputs in our setting. Formally, a probability ensemble is a set of random variables indexed by two indices, A and N. A will, in our context, represent the inputs or the outputs of the protocol execution, and N will be the security parameter, and the probability space is the randomness of all the parties, including the adversary. And we're going to define computation distinguishability between two probability ensembles. If for every distinguisher, every polynomial time distinguisher, there exists a negligible function, so that the probability that I'll be able to tell the difference between the first ensemble and the second ensemble is negligible. Okay, this is essentially what we do with encryption, but it's often not written in that way. In encryption, we come along and say that encryptions of 0 and encryptions of 1 look the same. And that's the same thing that we're saying here. We have these two ensembles who are actually very different distributions over outputs, and they both look the same. So anybody looking at the output of these two different distributions has no idea which one it came from, although they were generated very differently. Think pseudorandom generator. You have a very long random string, and you have another string which was generated pseudorandomly. They're computationally indistinguishable. Okay, we want to talk about functionalities. We're going to securely compute functionalities. A functionality rather than a function, arguable terminology, but functionality can be reactive, it can have a number of stages, it can be probabilistic, it's more general than just a regular function. So in general, we have a number of parties who wish to compute this function together. So there's an input vector x, and each party gets output. One way of defining it is to say that each party gets the same output, and that can be limiting in some other cases, and even in very specific things we'll see like Oblivious transfer. Actually, different parties receive different outputs, or only some receive output and some do not. So we can denote the functionality by f1 through fm means that the ith party will receive fi applied to the vector. If we're talking about two parties, then we'll often denote this, which means that x and y is mapped to f1 of xy and f2 of xy, where f1 is the first party's output and f2 is the second party's output. So that's how we denote the functionality. And now we're ready to define security for semi-honest adversaries. So just to recall, a semi-honest adversary follows the protocol execution but doesn't learn anything except for the output. How do we model the fact that someone doesn't learn anything except for the output? Instead, if someone doesn't learn anything, then it's somewhat easier. But if you think about zero knowledge, which we'll talk about later, but for those who are familiar, we define that someone didn't learn anything by saying that we can actually simulate their view based on their input alone. So we can generate a transcript which looks like a real protocol execution, but without actually having access to the secret input, but just to the output. And it's the same thing here. Each party has input and output, and that input and output in the real world is generated through interaction between the parties. And we want to try and generate a transcript that looks exactly the same as that real protocol execution, but based only on my input and output alone. So I don't get access, obviously, to the other party's input, because then it would be trivial and also would mean that I could actually learn something. I only have my input and output, and I'm able to somehow magically come up with a transcript that looks exactly like, or not exactly, but computationally distinguishable from a real protocol transcript. One thing which is important to think about or to understand when we're defining this is when I said based on my input and output, that's fine, because in the semi-honest model, the inputs are well defined. Each party just actually uses its given input because they're not trying to change, they're not behaving maliciously, they're not changing, doing anything apart from what the protocol tells them to do. So this is the formal definition, which I won't give. I'll give the graphic one, but I just put it there so it'll be in your slides. So I'm just taking this where it's here. So on the left-hand side, we have the real execution. And this is a protocol which is run between a party and a semi-honest adversary. So Kung Fu Panda is pretty benign. That's our benign adversary. And they run a protocol execution between them. They send messages back and forth. And at the end, the honest party on the right outputs its prescribed output. And the adversary on the left-hand side can actually output anything that it wants. And so this can model anything additional that the adversary is trying to learn beyond what it should, so it'll output whatever it can. On the right-hand side, we have the simulation. If you look at this simulator, the simulator is given the adversary's input and output only. So it's given x and f of x, y. It's not given y. So it doesn't know what y is. But what it manages to somehow do is it outputs some value here, which is going to look exactly like this. And these two sides have to be computationally indistinguishable. So the joint distribution of this output, along with the real output, the f of xy, the output of the function, is going to be look exactly the same as this pair here. That's what we define. That's the requirement from the simulator. The simulator is given the input and output of the corrupted party and tries to generate this the adversary's output. Without loss of generality, it can be the view of the adversary, just the transcript that it sees. Now, why is this meaningful? Why does this even give us what we want? So, if we think about the semi-honest setting, we talk about correctness and independence of inputs and fairness. All of these are non-issues because the parties are following the protocol. So, obviously, it's going to be correct. If the protocol is correct and both parties are honest, then it's also going to be correct when one of them is semi-honest. But what about privacy? This is the main property they want from semi-honest. Why does this definition guarantee privacy? And the answer is as follows. The adversary's view in the execution can actually be generated by its input and output alone. So in the real world, the adversary runs this protocol together with someone else. That's the way they get the output, because the output actually depends on both parties' input. If they don't interact, there's no way they can get the output. But we can imagine the situation where I'm just given the input and output, and I can actually generate that transcript by myself. If I can do that, then let's say that afterwards, given that transcript, I'm able to learn something. So if after a real protocol execution I'm able to learn more than I'm supposed to, given the protocol transcript, I can now plug in the simulator, and I'll still be able to learn that same thing. Because the transcript from the real execution and the simulator transcript look exactly the same. So if I can derive information from the real protocol transcript, I can also derive information from the simulated transcript. But the simulated transcript is based only on the input and output. So it means that I can learn that that information can be derived from the input and output. So let me give you an example. If I'm talking about an election, and we know that Obama won the election, okay? So I could come along and choose a certain person and guess that they voted for Obama. And I can claim that with probability greater than 1/2, I'm going to be correct. If I choose a random person from the United States and I say, you voted Obama, or a random person who voted in the United States, because a minority don't even vote, but a random person who voted in the United States and I say, you voted Obama, and I'll actually be correct with probability 1/2. So isn't this a breach of privacy? The answer is no, because that's actually something that can be learned just from the output alone. As soon as that was the candidate who won, we know they got a majority of the votes, so this is something which is derived from the output alone. And actually anything that I could learn can be derived from the output alone, because that transcript can be generated from the output alone. Right? That's why this paradigm actually is meaningful, and when we look at this, we can say, okay, anything you can learn in this world, you can learn in this world, but in this world you're only given the input and output. But now I want to confuse you a little bit and show you why actually this stuff is more difficult than it seems. If I'm saying that my view in the protocol execution can be generated from my input and output alone, why did I need to put on the slides that there's the output of the adversary together with the real output? Right? I said I want these joint distributions to actually be indistinguishable. I'm somehow binding the adversary's output together with the actual output of the function. It's not clear why that's necessary. This is actually, we're looking at the joint distribution of the adversary's output and the honest party's output. And this is the reason why it is actually essential to do. And it's unfortunate because it makes it harder to prove. Let's look at a functionality which is a stupid functionality. I agree, but as soon as we have the example of stupid functionality, we can find also for interesting ones, but the stupid ones are the easiest ones to understand. So let's look at a functionality where the first party A outputs a random bit, and the second party outputs nothing. Okay? Now if this is the functionality, it's clear that B should not learn A's output bit, because B should learn absolutely nothing. Now, it's true that we can do a secure protocol for this functionality, which has A just locally flip a random coin and output it. That would be a secure protocol. But here's another secure protocol. A chooses a random bit, outputs it, and sends it to B. Okay, now this should not be a secure protocol. If this is secure, then something is wrong with that definition, because B is not supposed to learn the random output of A. But if you define simulation separately, that the adversary's output is indistinguishable in the real and ideal model, and it's not somehow correlated to the actual output of the honest party, then you can actually simulate this protocol. Because B, when B is corrupted and learns actually nothing, they can just output a random bit. And this random bit will have the same distribution as in a real execution. It won't be correlated to the honest party's output, but the definition didn't require it to be correlated. So if we didn't require the joint distribution of the honest party's output and the adversary's output to be indistinguishable, then we can have absurd protocols which clearly, to any sane person, do not provide any guarantee of security. And that's why we actually need to look at the joint distribution, and this actually makes it significantly more difficult to prove. Fortunately, if the functionality is deterministic, so the function itself doesn't flip coins, it's not coin tossing, or it doesn't have any probabilistic factor involved, then it suffices to prove separately simulation, to prove correctness separately, and simulation just on the adversary's output. So if you're looking at deterministic functionalities, you can just look at each output separately, but if it's probabilistic, so if you're doing coin tossing, or if you're doing something like, I don't know, probabilistic statistical sampling of a database followed by outputting the statistics, then you have to actually look at the joint distribution. Okay, so we finished semi-honest adversaries. Actually, it's semi-honest, although it sounds like it's pretty easy, it's not that easy at all to prove. But when it comes next up to malicious adversaries, it's a piece of cake, because things now here start to get very, very messy. Not that I'm trying to encourage you not to do. This is a skill like any other skill. Once you master it, it's not that difficult, but it just takes time to... It's worth mastering it, because then it's easy afterwards. So the first attempt is to do the same thing we did beforehand, and to say that I want there to exist a simulator that generates the transcript or the view of the adversary given the input and the input and output of the corrupted party. Okay? Exactly the same as semi-honest. At first look, it doesn't seem like there should be any difference. Why should there be any difference between this and the semi-honest? Generate the view of the corrupted party from the input and output, and you're done. The problem is, what is the input of the corrupted party? Okay, so if you think of modeling each party as a Turing machine, and they have an input tape, and the protocol says to take that input and to run something, then the semi-honest setting is very, very clear, because the semi-honest party runs the code that it's supposed to run, so it takes the input that it's supposed to take. But a malicious party doesn't have to use the input that's written on its input tape. It can use another input. So how is a simulator supposed to generate the view of the adversary based on input which is not even explicitly given? In particular, the adversary can use an input, a different input, which is somehow hard-coded inside its code and maybe even obfuscated, and that's the basis for its computation, and the simulator isn't able to talk about, we can't refer to the inputs that are on the input tape. They're not explicit. Beyond that, one of the things that we mentioned is that in the semi-honest setting, correctness and independence of inputs and fairness are a non-issue, but in the malicious setting, they're very much an issue. Okay, the attacker may want to try and breach correctness, and if I just say that I can simulate the view of the adversary, I don't capture these properties at all. Okay, so I need to take this into account as well. Another thing that's that it's important noting is we sometimes think about correctness and privacy as sort of separate goals that are not connected to each other. This is actually far from the truth. And think about the following situation. Let's say I have a function f that you want to compute, and instead of computing that function, I managed to cause, me as an adversary, I managed to cause the computation to be such that they compute a completely different function which reveals the first bit of the other party's input. Is this a breach of correctness or a breach of privacy? If the first bit of the other party's input is not necessarily revealed by the original function, then it's a breach of both. You can't separate privacy and correctness. And in fact, when I said that I want a definition that captures everything, it wasn't just because it's easy to understand. Actually defining secure computation by privacy and correctness separately is something which is almost impossible to do, because there is no separation between them. A breach of correctness, it can actually be a breach of privacy. Likewise, by the independence of inputs and privacy, if I say that I can make my input be $1 more than the other highest bid. So on the one hand, the protocol is correct because I made my input be higher, so I actually get the correct output, and the independence of inputs is what's breached. But I actually learn a lot about the second bid, the other party's bid, right? I know the second highest bid was $1 less than mine. So it's also, in some extent, a breach of privacy. So you can't separate these out at all, and we have to somehow give one definition which captures all of these different things together. So let's, instead of trying to think hard about how to define it, let's think about what the best thing in the world could possibly be. And the best thing that could possibly be in the world is that there was actually someone who we trusted. Okay, this would be nice. Now, for someone that I trust, everybody maybe trusts their mom, so that's fine, but we want someone that everybody trusts and not that everybody trusts one person. But if we had someone that everybody trusted, this is an incorruptible trusted party that we know could never cheat, what we call an ideal world, because we're cynical cryptographers and we don't believe in trust, then what we could do is that everyone would just send their inputs to this trusted party via ideally secure communication lines. The trusted party would compute the function and send back the output to all the other parties. So this is great. This captures exactly what we want. It's an ideal world. Let's think of privacy. Everyone only learns the output because the trusted party is not going to reveal anything because they're not corruptible. They're not going to reveal anything but the output. So obviously every party only receives the output because they send their input to someone and got back the output, which is based on everyone but nothing else. What about correctness? It's clear again. The trusted party received input from everybody and computed the function correctly, so we have correctness. Independence of inputs. Well, everybody send their inputs to the trusted party over ideally secure communication lines, which also don't exist, but we're just pretending they do because we want an ideal model. And the output was only received afterwards. So when I sent my input, I hadn't learned anything. Obviously, it's independent of everybody else's input. And also with fairness, same thing, everybody gets output together. So this is an ideal world, and this is something that we would really want to try and get. And if we had this incorruptible trusted party, then all our problems would be solved and wouldn't actually have to be here this week, because we could just use that trusted party, send the inputs, and get back the outputs. Note that in this world, there's only one thing that an adversary can do, and that's choose its input. Okay? So the only thing an adversary can do is choose its input, and they can't do anything beyond that. Now, there are different ways of interpreting that sentence, by the way, and this is actually quite important when you think about applications of secure computation. One way of interpreting is, oh, but that's great, that's fine, because everybody's allowed to choose their own input. If everybody's allowed to choose their own input, then this means that nothing whatsoever can be done. Another way of interpreting this sentence is actually something completely different, which is this is an inherent limitation of secure computation. So let's say we wanted to go back to Yao's original millionaire problem, which is you have two people who want to know who earns more. What's going to force me to actually input my correct salary? I can input a much, much higher salary. So maybe then I won't learn necessarily whether I really earn more than the other party or not. But the question is, what's the what's my aim? So let's say that I've gone for a job interview, and instead of playing this stupid game where the interviewer says to me, okay, so how much do you want for this, how much do you want to earn? And I say, well, you tell me how much you want to offer me. So then I say, okay, so let's do a secure computation where I'll give you how much I'm earning now, and you'll give me how much you want to offer me, and we'll see if I'm earning more than what you offer me, then you should up your offer. And the other guy says, that's a really good idea. And so I put in 85,000 shekels a month, or which is, say, $20,000, over $20,000 a month, which isn't bad for a professor in university. And I get a much, much higher offer than otherwise I would have got. Okay, so the fact that the only thing you can do is choose your input can actually have very big ramifications on the application of secure computation. Okay, so this is something which is very important to keep in mind. Another thing, by the way, is when we say the only thing you learn is the output, that can also be a problem. Because let's think about doing a secure computation to compute the average of two people's salary. Okay, so I want to work out, Vadim and me want to compute what the average of our two salaries are. Well, we don't have to be geniuses to understand that if I know my input, I know the average of our two salaries, I also know Vadim's salary, so this is an obvious one, but there are many other settings where we look at database computations, the output itself can actually be very, very damaging and can breach privacy. That's complete out of scope of secure computation. So you have to be careful that what you're computing is actually something that you should compute. Okay, let's get back to the real ideal model paradigm. We have this ideal model, and what we're going to say is something very simple. I want the real model to behave, the real protocol to behave like the ideal world. So now I have a real protocol, there's no trusted party, we don't trust anyone, we're back to being cynical cryptographers, but we want our real protocol where the parties interact to actually behave like this ideal world. And we're going to formalize this notion like in the semi-honest. We're going to say that for every real adversary A attacking the real protocol where there's no trusted party, there exists an adversary S who runs in the ideal world but manages to get the outputs to look the same. So this simulator S actually simulates a real protocol execution while interacting in the ideal world. When the ideal world, it has no power whatsoever except just to choose its input. That's the only thing it can do, but somehow manages to get the output distribution to look exactly the same as in a real world. So here's graphically, we have the real world, we have this truly adversarial party, not Kung Fu Panda anymore, and he's trying to attack the protocol. He has arbitrary output, which again, without loss of generality, can be its view, but it's now generated by running any arbitrary malicious strategy. We have the honest party's output, and then we look at the ideal world. In the ideal world, the corrupted party sends some x prime. It's not necessarily its real input x, it's not necessarily its prescribed input x. The honest party obviously does input its prescribed input y, and they get back f of x prime of y, f of x prime and y, and the adversary outputs whatever it wants, and we want these things to be computationally indistinguishable. So really the real protocol behaves and looks like this ideal world because they look the same. There's actually a lot involved in proving security like this, and this is the last hour of today where I'm going to focus on how we prove security in a malicious setting, at least theoretically, and this will be something which will come up a lot. A lot of things that we'll be talking about in the next 3 days when we say we do this to prevent the adversary from doing that, or so that the simulator can do this, has a lot to do with proving security in this model. Again, the formal definition I'm going to skip, but let's go back to the properties that we want. Privacy. Why is privacy guaranteed in this definition? Because we have we have the adversary's output, and we have in the real world and in the ideal world. If the adversary could learn more than what's allowed by the input-output, then in the ideal world, the simulator would also get that information. But the simulator in the ideal world only has the input and output. So whatever it outputs and looks exactly the same as in the real has to be derivable from that. So it's impossible to learn more than what you can derive from the input and output, because that's all that you have in the ideal world. Correctness is if we look at the other side, not the adversary's output, but the honest party's output. In the ideal world, the honest party outputs the correct output as computed by the trusted party. So if in the real protocol somehow the adversary made the output be incorrect, then you would be able to distinguish between the real and ideal worlds. So that's also impossible. Likewise, independence of inputs. The adversary in the ideal world has to send its input independently from the honest party. So if somehow in the real world the adversary could make its input be correlated, you'd be able to distinguish the ideal and real worlds. Likewise, fairness, etc., because again in the ideal world you have it, and if you didn't have it in the real world you'd be able to distinguish. So all these properties are encapsulated and captured by this one very, very clean definition of looking at the ideal world. Just as a note, in some cases this ideal world is too ideal, and for example fairness, which we said you cannot achieve in general, is captured by this ideal model, and that's too strong. So what can we do? The simple thing to do is simply change the instructions in the ideal model. So we explicitly make the ideal model be different. So for example, the trusted party will receive the input from all parties. It will send the output only to the adversary. The adversary will then decide whether computation should be continued or halted. If it says continue, then the trusted party will send the output to the honest parties, and if it sends halt, it won't. So once again, we have a very, very clean ideal model. It's very clear to understand what's happening, but we've neutralized the fairness property. This protocol is no longer fair in this setting, and if you can simulate the protocol in the ideal world, then you get all the other properties except for fairness. So you can play around with the ideal model and add different things that you want in order to model what you can achieve, but again while keeping a clean and easy to understand definition. There's also a notion of reactive functionalities where parties send inputs and get outputs in multiple stages. Like for example, if you want to play poker online, you don't necessarily trust the online gambling website. I'm not sure why anybody does trust them, but they seem to because it's a big business. Then you want this thing where cards are dealt and thrown and redealt again. So you want something which is an ideal model which is actually interactive or reactive. It happens over stages. And there are many things you can do with functionalities, but we won't go into it much more. So what are the advantages of the approach? Again, it captures all applications. The security guarantees achieved are easily understood because the ideal model is easy to understand. Right? Everybody can understand this concept of a trusted party. You send the inputs and get the output back. You don't have to be cryptographer to understand that, and therefore it's very easy to understand what guarantees to be achieved. And it also has very important ramifications to the use of secure computation. I want to explain to an engineer what the guarantees they have, and then I'll use that within their application. It's very easy for me to explain to them. Think you have a black box that computes this function in a trusted way. That's all you need to understand. Once you understand that, then now you can use this in your application. In terms of analyzing the security application, it makes it quite easy. I don't have to look at all the internal workings of this secure protocol, which are really messy and complicated. I just need to imagine this black box and think, well, if I have this trusted party computing this function, if my application will remain secure in that setting, then everything is going to be fine. And that's really what we do here, and this is very, very advantageous. On that note of looking at this application and viewing the secure computation as a black box, this is exactly what we call sequential modular composition, which I don't want to go into too much. I just want to talk about this concept of a hybrid model. What it means is that we look at this world where both real messages are sent and also there's a trusted party. And we use the trusted party to compute this sub-functionality, and everything else is real. And we want to analyze the security in this world, and what we actually say, formally there, but I'm not going to go, it's in the slides, you can look at it later. What we actually say is that if you have a real protocol that securely computes this functionality, then you can analyze this larger application by looking at the secure protocol as a black box with the trusted party. So it makes it very useful for analyzing the security application, but it's also very useful for analyzing the security of actual secure computation protocols. I don't have to build a proof which looks at the entire protocol at once. I can build small sub-protocols, and I can prove security while looking at those sub-protocols as being black boxes with the trusted party, and that makes it much easier to prove. When much easier to prove still means very difficult, but that's life. Let me skip this. Sometimes when we want to look at high efficiency, we can consider a weaker definition. So for example, we said semi-honest, which is weak. We talked about covert adversaries. I mentioned them beforehand. This can also enable us to get higher efficiency. There's also, sometimes we try to define privacy only, but this is actually very, very problematic, and you can sometimes do it for very specific things, but it's very often not clear the guarantees that you get, and sometimes you can be fooled into thinking you're getting more than you actually are. So in some of the definitions, before I move on to Oblivious transfer, we talked about semi-honest adversaries and how you define security. We talked about this idea that you simulate the transcript, the view of the adversary in the protocol execution, and you simulate that based only on the input and output, and that proves that nothing more is learned than the input and output, or said otherwise, if the adversary after a real protocol execution can learn something, then they can learn that also only from the input and output, because the protocol execution itself can be simulated. There's a subtlety here which is very important related to probabilistic functionalities. You have to look at the joint distribution, not separately. In the malicious world, it's more complicated to prove, but actually the definition itself is very, very clean and looks at this ideal model. We have an ideal trusted party. Everyone sends the input and gets their output back, and the real protocol should behave exactly like that. And there are more advanced topics which I'm not going to go into, which relate to concurrency, to relaxed definitions, to adaptive security, which I didn't talk about at all. Before I go on to talk about Oblivious transfer, I want to mention something which I think is a change over the last few years, in the last 5 years or so, when we talk about efficient secure computation, or practical secure computation. Most of the school here, the protocols we're going to see, most of them, except for the exception of a couple of things that Benny will talk about, are general protocols that work for any functionality. And these protocols work by taking the function that you want to compute and compiling into a Boolean or arithmetic circuit. You can do it from C code, or you can do it using some other sort of compiler, but you build some Boolean or arithmetic circuit that computes the functionality. And then you have some method of computing this circuit in a secure way. So you actually use no specific properties whatsoever about the functionality. Okay, you don't look at what's happening inside, you don't try to do anything special around the functionality. Now for specific problems that you want to solve, like for example in threshold cryptography, there are more efficient ways of doing this. But actually in many, many cases, it's not necessarily the case. Now it seems it should be more efficient in this last line. It would seem that for specific problems, if you can utilize properties of the actual functionality, it will be much, much more efficient. And that's what people thought for a very long time. But actually, when we look at studying general protocols or specific protocols, there are many advantages to the general protocol approach. First, you implement it once, and all you have to do is change the circuit, and you can compute anything that you want. It's also very flexible. Let's say that you want to compute the set intersection of two sets. Then if you have a specific protocol, and now someone says, okay, I want to compute the set intersection, but I only want to give the output if the set intersection is at least 20 items large. Then the protocol that you have actually can be made completely useless. In fact, you may have to throw it out and start from scratch. But the difference between a circuit that computes the intersection and a circuit that computes the intersection as long as it's greater than 20 items is almost zero. So you actually don't have to change anything. And what's most surprising is that in many cases, it's actually the general solution is competitive. And it's the fastest solution known. And this is very, very surprising. But actually, Benny and I had a work we recently did, and we started off by trying to design a specific protocol, and we worked on it for a few days, and we realized that what we're getting to was actually no better than the general protocol, and we may as well just take the general protocol. And this is happening more and more as the general protocols become more and more efficient. In many cases, that's actually the case, and that's why we're going to focus on that in the school. Okay, so for those of you who hate definitions, but like algorithmic constructions, you can erase the last hour, or at least wake up, and say, okay, I know that it's supposed to look like this ideal model, I know it's supposed to simulate, but now show me how these things actually work, I mean, what actually we're doing here. And now we have half an hour, which will be, I think will be easier. Okay, so we're looking at the Oblivious transfer protocol. The Oblivious transfer functionality was proposed by Michael Rabin in a handwritten manuscript which you can find online. And this is another version of that which is by EGL, Evan Goldrachen, and Lemper. Lemper, yeah. And it works as follows. We have Alice and Bob. Alice has a pair of inputs x0 and x1, and Bob has a choice bit sigma. The functionality is defined by Bob learning one of the outputs and only one of the outputs, and Alice learning absolutely nothing. Okay? So I've drawn it in this way with this black box, but this is exactly the ideal real model paradigm. We assume we have some black box computing it. So Alice sends its input and gets back nothing. She gets back nothing. I'll denote an empty output by lambda. Okay, so she gets the empty output, she learns nothing. And Bob will get x sub sigma, so obviously if sigma equals 0, he gets x0, and if sigma equals 1, he'll get x1, but he'll only learn one of them. And it's a bit paradoxical, how is this possible? Because if Bob was allowed to learn both inputs that Alice had, then Alice could just send both of them to Bob, and then Alice wouldn't learn anything about sigma, that's obvious. And if Alice was allowed to learn Bob's input, sigma, then Bob could send sigma to Alice, and Alice would just send whichever of the two inputs Bob is supposed to learn. So both of those cases is fine, but how is it possible for Alice to obliviously transfer one input? So she's giving only one of the inputs, but she's not knowing what she's giving. She has no idea what input she's actually giving to Bob. It's a paradox. It doesn't seem to be possible, but that's the beauty of cryptography. We do lots of impossible things. And this is really one of the simplest and beautiful, and really a beautiful construction. And it's called 1 out of 2 oblivious transfer because Bob is getting 1 out of 2 of Alice's inputs. Before going to how we compute this, I want to just mention that it's a fundamental primitive. It's complete. What does it mean by complete? Theoretically, this means that if you're able to securely compute oblivious transfer, you can actually use that to compute any functionality. not efficiently, but in sense of the assumptions that you need, the cryptographic assumptions that you need. If you can do oblivious transfer, you can do absolutely everything. However, it's not so easy to do oblivious transfer. For example, if you're just given public key encryption, which is reasonably strong in the crypto world, and in a black box manner, you can't actually do oblivious transfer. You can construct it, though, from most of the asymmetric assumptions that we have. I think maybe even all of them. So enhanced chapter permutations, which is like RSA and Rabin, etc. From the decisional Diffie-Hellman assumption, from lattices, from essentially all of the specific assumptions that we have which are asymmetric. There are a few important results. One is that OT is symmetric, so you can reverse the roles of Alice and Bob very easily. If you're given a protocol for getting 1 out of n OT, oblivious transfer, then you can actually efficiently get, if you have 1 out of 2 OT, then you can easily construct 1 out of n OT or k out of n OT. These can also be done efficiently. If you're given OT from semi-honest adversaries in a black box way, you can get a malicious security for OT, but not efficiently. And there are many variants like random OT, which is where both the inputs of both sides are random and not necessarily given. Rabin OT, weak OT, which all turn out to be equivalent. So there's a lot to study here also in terms of the theoretical foundations of oblivious transfer. We'll actually talk about random OT later on today. Or tomorrow, actually. Tomorrow I'll talk about it, not today. Okay, so I want to construct efficient oblivious transfer from the decisional Diffie-Hellman assumption. So we're given a group G, a order Q with a generator G. And just to recall, the DDH assumption says that if you're given a tuple, which is the generator, and then G to the A, G to the B, and G to the AB, where A and B are random, this actually looks the same as G to the A, G to the B, and G to the C, where C is random as well. Okay, so this fourth item, this fourth value is fully determined by the first three. Fully determined by them. And here it's completely random, so information theoretically the distributions are very, very, very different. But computationally no one can tell the difference. Okay, this is with in the notation of a multiplicative group, but it's the same concept also of elliptic curve additive groups. So we're going to use Ergomal encryption. How does Ergomal encryption work? You have a random value A chosen from ZQ. The public key is just H, which is G to the power of A, and the secret key is A. In order to encrypt a value M, which we're going to assume is in the group, you choose a random R. You compute U to be G to the R and V to be H to the R times M, and that's your encryption. The basic idea is that because of the decisional Diffie-Hellman assumption, given G to the R, H to the R looks random. And if H to the R looks random, then it can mask M, like a one-time pad sort of thing. In order to decrypt, you just compute V divided by U to the A, and if you just can look, so V divided by U to the A, we know that V is H to the R times M, and U is G to the R, so you plug that in. Now you raise G to the R by A, which means you just can exchange those, but G to the A is H. So you get H to the R down the bottom, and they cancel out, and you're left with M. Okay, that's Ergomal encryption. And this is how we can now do semi-honest oblivious transfer. Okay, so it's magic. If you haven't seen this before, this is pure magic. If you've seen it before, then it's boring, and you can sleep. Somehow, Bob is going to get one of Alice's inputs without Alice knowing which one Bob got. So what Bob is going to do is choose two Ergomal keys, essentially. But he's going to choose them in a way that he only knows one of the secret keys. Okay, so he's going to choose a random A sub sigma, because sigma is the value that or actually there should be sigma, not B here. Okay, he's going to choose A sub sigma and compute H sub sigma to be G to the power of A sub sigma. So if Bob is going to get 0, then he'll choose A0 and H0, which is G to the power of A0. And he'll choose H1 to be completely random. And then Bob will send H0 and H1 to Alice. Now what's important to understand about H0 and H1 is very simple. Bob knows the secret key for one of them and doesn't know the secret key for the other. Okay? So in Ergomal, that means he can decrypt something which is encrypted under one of the keys, but cannot decrypt something which is encrypted under the other key. So what Alice does is very simple. Alice encrypts x0 with h0 and encrypts x1 with h1 and sends them back to Bob. Bob gets C0 and C1 but can only decrypt one of them, which is the one that he knows the secret key for. Okay, just note that these encryptions are four group elements, U0, V0 and U1, V1. Now, on the one hand, this is magic. On the other hand, it's also something which is very disturbing about this protocol, because the first thing you want to say is, okay, but what can Bob do? Just choose both public keys, both Elgamal keys, so he knows the secret key, and Alice can't tell the difference. But Bob is semi-honest, so Bob doesn't do that. So when we want to get, this is one of the reasons why we say that semi-honest security is not necessarily so difficult to break. This is a great example to show. Right? It's not difficult to now construct a malicious adversary who has to make a minor change and undetectably will be able to learn everything. Okay, so if you have a protocol which is secure for semi-honest adversaries, but you have a malicious adversary, you can be completely dead. And this is an example that Alice will not even know that something bad happened. But leave that aside for now. Just think about the fundamental situation when Bob is behaving nicely, it's true, but he's still managing to get only one of the inputs of Alice without learning the other one, without Alice knowing what he got. So there is this oblivious transfer property, which is very, very nice. How do I prove security? Because it's a school, we want to construct these things ourselves afterwards, we're going to have to know how to prove security. So Alice sees two public keys. That's all she sees. One of them, Bob knows the private key for, and the other one he doesn't. But Alice has no idea, and we can easily simulate by just writing two random elements, two random group elements. These will have exactly the same distribution of H0 and H1, and it doesn't really matter what Bob is able to decrypt or not. It makes no difference in distribution. In terms of how do we simulate for Bob we need to somehow get a situation, we need to somehow generate these two ciphertexts that Alice sent that will be indistinguishable to Bob from a real execution. Well, that's very simple. We're given Bob's input and output. Okay, so we're given the bit that Bob is supposed to learn, and we're given the output that Bob is supposed to learn. So we just, all we need to do is encrypt the correct output under the correct key. So encrypt X sigma under H sigma, and just encrypt garbage under the other one. Because Bob is only able to decrypt one of the values, this is indistinguishable from his view in a real execution. So we can formally simulate both Alice and Bob's view given the input and output as we wanted. But I want to show you just a very, very small change to the protocol which increases efficiency. Okay, and this is like the first step into what we're trying to focus on in this school. So again, Bob is going to do the same thing. He's going to choose two Elgamal keys, one of which he knows the private key and the other he doesn't, and send them to Alice. But instead of Alice computing two Elgamal encryptions, she's going to compute G to the R once, and then compute H0 to the R times X0 and H1 to the R times X1. So instead of doing G to the R twice separately for V0 and V1, she's going to do it once only and send U, V0 and V1 back to Bob. And Bob will do the same thing as beforehand. But this time there will be only one U. Okay? Now this can be shown to be secure under the decisional Diffie-Hellman assumption exactly as beforehand. And what we've managed to do is we've managed to save one group element. Now it might not seem like something which is very significant, but as we'll see later on, and we'll talk about a lot over the week, communication is a very big bottleneck these days in secure computation. Cryptographic computations have become more and more and more efficient, and actually the bottleneck has often become the communications. If I can reduce the communication, that's significant. I've also reduced the number of exponentiations of Alice from 4 to 3. So I'm actually saving 25% of the time. That's something which, if you're doing thousands of these things, can become very significant. What happens if we're talking about malicious adversaries? So if you have a malicious adversary here, then the sender, Alice, can't cheat. She just gets two Elgamal keys. She can't really do very much. And the simulator can extract, which is something which won't make too much sense now. I'll talk about that later on. But as I mentioned, if the receiver is corrupted, then he can choose two public keys for which he knows both of the secret keys. So how can we prevent him from doing this? If we want us to achieve security in the presence of malicious adversaries, we somehow have to prevent the receiver from choosing these two public keys in an arbitrary way, which will enable it to be able to decrypt both. And here's one idea of how to do it. Alice will start by sending a random group element W. And because it's a random group element, then Bob does not know the discrete log of W. And Bob will choose H0 and H1 so that their product equals W. Okay? And Bob can easily do this by choosing one of the private keys. So chooses A sigma, computes H sigma to be G to the power of A sigma, and sets the other H to be W divided by the first H that he received. So that's here. And now he's got H0 and H1 whose product equals W. Okay? And he knows, again, the private key of H sigma. Now what's very easy to show is that if Bob knows the discrete logs of both H0 and H1, so he knows the private keys of both H0 and H1, then he knows the discrete log of W. So this will then, you can use that to construct an adversary or break the discrete log assumption. Okay, so this actually prevents Bob from choosing two private keys that he knows. However, it becomes messy in the proof. You actually need a random oracle here, because just saying you don't completely know the private key is not enough to say you don't learn anything about the value. And so if you hash and use a random oracle, you can actually get this to be maliciously secure. Actually not for simulation, for privacy only. Let's just leave it at that as an idea of how you can start dealing with these things. The state of the art when we talk about oblivious transfer is as follows. For semi-honest adversaries, it's very efficient. We can 2 exponentiations for the receiver and sending 2 group elements. For the sender, it's 3 exponentiations and sending 3 group elements. For the malicious adversaries, if you're in the random oracle and you don't want full simulation, then you can get like semi-honest. But actually, if you want proper full security, which is what we need typically, then the receiver computes 3 exponentiations, it sends 2 group elements, and the sender sends 8 exponentiations, which effectively cost 6, we won't go into it, and 4 group elements. And this is actually the best protocol that we have, and it's very, very efficient in practice. An exponentiation, by the way, these days costs a couple of hundred microseconds, depending on what computer you're running. Okay, so we have 10 minutes left, and I want to talk a little bit about why it's difficult to prove security in the malicious setting, and then in the last hour of the day, when everybody's wide awake and full of energy, I'll come back and discuss it in more detail. So we need to prove that our real protocol behaves like this ideal world. And so what we actually need is an adversary who's going to somehow internally, a simulator, sorry, who's going to somehow internally run the real adversary and externally interact with the trusted party. So we have this setting where we're constructing an ideal adversary. An ideal adversary who's not himself ideal, but he runs in the ideal model. So we construct this adversary, and the adversary has to send an input to the trusted party and get back an output. Now, in order for this to look like the real world, the input that the adversary, the simulator, is going to send to the trusted party has to actually be the real input that the real adversary uses in the real protocol. We don't know what that input is, right? And it's not written on any input tape, because the adversary set can actually have something which is internally hardwired or something. But somehow the adversary has to be able to, the simulator has to be able to extract that value, send it to the trusted party, then get back the output, and now make a transcript of the computation which will match what happens in the real world. Now, because we don't know what the adversary is going to do, in a semi-honest world, everything is very well defined. You know exactly what code the adversary is going to run, because the adversary is running the correct protocol specification. But here the adversary can do anything. The only way to simulate this and make it look like the real world is the simulator has to somehow have to send messages to the real adversary that look like messages from an honest party. But remember, the honest party actually is sending messages based on its real input. And here the simulator doesn't have its real input. The simulator only has the output, and someone has to send dummy messages that will look real, but end up computing the correct output. It's a very, very strange sort of thing to do. I'm going to try and demonstrate this in the 10 minutes I have left on the problem of coin tossing, which is quite a simple problem. It'll be enough to make you, well, hopefully not regret coming, but understand that it's not. This stuff is often it's difficult. It's very tricky. But as I said before, it's a skill. You acquire the skill and you're fine. But it does require work to acquire. So this is Blum's protocol. Blum's protocol goes back to the 80s. So how to toss a coin in the well, coin tossing in the well, he called it. Okay, so two friends are on the phone and they want to decide what movie to go to, and they can't decide. So they say, let's flip a coin. And so one says, okay, I'll flip it and I'll tell you whether you won or not. And the other one says, no, I don't trust you. So here they can flip a coin over the phone. Okay. It uses commitments, but I don't want to define commitments yet at this stage, so I'll just talk about El Gamal. Party P1 chooses the random bit B, and two values are S, and essentially encrypts B under El Gamal. So it sends G to the R, G to the S, computes the H equals G to the R is an El Gamal public key. Then it computes G to the S, which is the first value of the El Gamal encryption, and H to the S times G to the B, which is essentially an encryption of 0 or 1. And sends HU of V to P2. Okay. Note that HU and V fully define the value B, which is this random bit that P1 shows. But because El Gamal encryption, party P2 gets HU and V and doesn't know what the value of B is. So party P2 just chooses the random bit B prime and sends it back to B1 to P1. P1 gets this bit B prime and now sends all the randomness that it used in its first step, which is R, S, and B. And party P2 verifies that R, S, and B really do explain these values H, U, and V. And at that point, both parties just output the XOR of B and B prime. Okay, so that's Blum's coin tossing. Why is it secure? Let's think about a corrupt P2. So corrupt P2 receives an El Gamal encryption of the bit B and then sends back B prime. Because the El Gamal encryption is secure, it knows nothing whatsoever about B when it chooses B prime. So B prime is independent of B, at least computationally. Likewise, a corrupt P1 sends this El Gamal encryption of B before seeing B prime, obviously, because it sends it straight away. And it's bound to the value B. It can't choose any other value to explain that El Gamal encryption, because the El Gamal encryption fully defines the value B. So now, P1 cannot change its bit because it's committed to this value B, and therefore it's unable to influence the output. Okay, so P2 chooses B prime after B, so obviously it'll be independent. You can think about an envelope. I put a bit B into an envelope and give it to the other party. The other party then says their bit, and then we open the envelope. Neither party is able to influence the result of the computation. So this is very, very intuitive and very, very nice, but let's look at what happens when we actually formally prove this in the ideal real model paradigm. Okay, it becomes a little bit more difficult to do, but it's not too bad, but it's a good exercise to do. So let's think of what happens when P1 is corrupted. So we have a real adversary A, and we want to construct a simulator S as follows. The first thing we know is that S, there's no input in coin tossing, so there's no inputs to be sent to the trusted party, but there is an output. So S receives a random bit beta from the trusted party. And what S's aim now is to do is to run the protocol together with the corrupted P1 or with the adversary A, and have the result of the execution be this random bit that he got from the trusted party. Now it's somewhat, again, paradoxical, because we said that the whole point of the protocol is you're unable to bias the output. So you're not able to, if no party is able to bias the output, why suddenly is a simulator able to make the result be better if it wants? And the reason is that he has a secret trick under his sleeve, which is called rewinding. So S invokes the adversary A and receives back H, U, and V. And then S works as follows. S internally hands A the value B prime equals 0. And then he rewinds A and hands A the value B prime equals 1. Now rewinding is sort of a strange thing, or it used to be before the world of virtualization, But now you can just think of rewinding as the following thing. You take a snapshot of A, okay, and then you run A forward, and then you just go back to the beginning of the snapshot. That's what rewinding all is about. So you run actually A twice on giving it both bits, B equals 0, B prime equals 0, and B prime equals 1, and you look at what happens with A. Now A is a malicious adversary, so it doesn't necessarily even reply correctly to both values. We actually don't know what A is going to do. Now if A did reply correctly both times, then the simulator S learns the value B, because A reveals all of its randomness, and if S knows the value B, what it can now do is set B prime to be B XOR beta, and this will be the transcript that he gives A, or that he outputs. He outputs a transcript which he gets the first message from A, and the B prime that results in B XOR B prime equal beta, which he got from the trusted party. And that's all he needs to do. If A does not correctly reply either time, then that's also fine, because that means that it's just an abort. We know that P1 just didn't finish the protocol execution, and that's also easy. But if A aborts once and completes once, then once again the simulator learned the output. It can set B prime to be B XOR beta, but now it'll complete the execution depending on which case it is, whether A completed it or not. And this is the continue and the halt that we talked about. So if the B prime, which results in beta, is the case where A continued, then the simulator will send continue to the trusted party, in which case the honest party in the ideal world will receive output. And otherwise it will send halt, in which case the honest party will not. So it's not terrible, this proving this, but you can see the additional complexities which are arising. You have to look at what happens to A. Does A complete? Does A not? Does A actually abort? And you have to do this rewinding in order to have more information about what A is actually doing. What about the case where P2 is corrupted? Once again we have an adversary A, and S works as follows. S again receives a random bit beta from the trusted party, and S invokes A and then works as follows. It chooses a random bit B and commits to B, sends an encryption, an algorithm encryption of B to the adversary internally. And S receives back a B prime from A. If B XOR B prime equals beta, then this is wonderful. That means that we've actually got an execution that finished correctly, and S outputs that execution, sends continue, and we're done. Otherwise, S just rewinds A and goes back to the very beginning. And we continue it over and over again. In this specific case, we don't have to take into account any abort, because there's only a single bit, and so we can always just assume that if P2 sends nothing, then it's going to be 0. So you just rewind over and over again until you succeed. You expect to succeed after 2 times, but it can take longer, but the probability that you'll have to do more than n times is going to be negligible in n. By the way, just to introduce a complexity here, one of the things we actually have to do here is prove that actually this completes in polynomial time, which involves also reduction to the security of the commitments. But I'm not going to go into that. So in summary of this part, we looked at Oblivious transfer. It's a very fundamental primitive. We're going to talk about it a lot throughout the school. You'll see it many, many times. It's heavily used in all generic C computation protocols, in most, sorry. In speeds you don't use speeds you don't, but apart from speeds you use it everywhere else. It's very efficient, but it does cost exponentiations each time. So it's true it's on a couple of hundred microseconds, but if you have to do 3,000 of them, then that already becomes very expensive. And this afternoon we'll talk about how to improve that, and tomorrow even more. And achieving security for malicious adversaries is difficult. Again, the last hour of today we'll reconsider it, and the next 3 days this will be a lot of what the effort is in how to prevent the adversary from doing what it's not supposed to do in a way that still you're able to simulate and you preserve efficiency. So thank you. I will take a half an hour break, and then we'll come back to hear Benny.